Good morning. I'm Michael Smerconish in today for Chris Jansing. Voter suppression or ballot security. The controversy over requiring a photo ID to vote is a debate playing itself out across the country. And today, the epicenter is Alabama. That's where hundreds are gathering right now for the fifth and final day of the March for Civil and Voter Rights, led by the Reverend Al Sharpton. It commemorates the historic Selma to Montgomery Voting Rights March that took place in 1965. The marchers are protesting voter ID laws that have passed in 15 states, saying they're an attack on hard-won voting rights. In addition to that, 13 states have introduced new voter ID proposals, and 11 states have introduced proposals to strengthen existing voter ID laws. Joining me now is the host of MSNBC's Politics Nation, the Reverend Al Sharpton. Reverend, thank you for being here. I take it you see concerted effort, concerted activity. This is not a coincidence on the part of all of these states.
Not at all. When you look at the fact that, according to all of the data from the Justice Department, there's been 0.0003% voter fraud. There is no widespread voter fraud. The only voter fraud is the fraud that there is widespread voter fraud. We are looking at a situation where you have a solution to no problem. So therefore, it only leads us to believe, since the collateral damage is that, according to the Brennan Institute, 5 million people will be disenfranchised from voting because they don't have photo ID, that must be the goal in the minds of some, to eliminate voters, because you're certainly not protecting us against voter fraud because it's not there in a widespread level.
I've talked about it extensively on the radio, not only this week, but for the last several weeks. And you'll not be surprised, sir, to hear that a sentiment I often hear is that folks say, well, I have to show an ID for everything. In fact, I had to show my ID to get into 30 Rock today. Why not show an ID when you're going out to exercise the franchise? An ID of some kind.
And you should, and you do. The fact of the matter, let's take Alabama, for example, where we're having the McMarch today. They have a voter ID law that they put in place in 2003 where you can show your ID or show your utilities bill or something. Why do you now need to go in 2012 to a more state-sponsored ID? The IDs that are in place already are sufficient. So we're not saying no voter ID. We're saying, why are you having voter ID that is limited to a state license or a passport when, in fact, senior students and a disproportionate amount of minorities don't have those IDs?
In other words,
we're not saying no ID.
What you're saying, and I think this makes great common sense, is show an ID of some kind that is tapered or tailored to the particular community in which folks are voting, so that, for example, if it's a community where you don't have... Yes, sir.
Which is what we've historically done. What I'm saying is that the ID that we used when we voted for Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Bush, why all of a sudden we changing the ID laws now if there's been no problem of voter fraud with IDs? So then why all of a sudden are we changing the identification needed unless there was some breakout of widespread ID counterfeiting going on, which there has not been the case. So why the difference now?
I had a phone caller yesterday who raised a point I think you'll like to hear, and his argument was, to the extent that there's such concern about voter fraud, interesting that thus far in the Republican primary process, no one has alleged any of the type of fraud that would seem to warrant these wholesale changes. In other words, it doesn't seem to have been problematic for the last several weeks.
And the interesting part about that is that it's the Republicans pushing it, but they didn't push it in their own primaries. And we saw in Iowa where they announced Romney was the winner, and then all of a sudden we found Santorum won. Nobody said, oh, was it voter ID? And those were caucuses. Those were not even where you go to the poll. So do they really believe in voter ID, or is this voter suppression? That's why we're marching, because we won the right to vote 47 years ago, marching Selma to Montgomery. We must protect the right to vote by being against all forms of voter suppression. And we see these over 30 states is engaged in voter suppression because there is no fraud that they're trying to combat here.
Reverend Al Sharpton, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
So let's bring in our panel now. Richard Bloomingdale is the president of the Pennsylvania AFL-CIO. Joy-Ann Reid is the managing editor of thegrio.com, and Crystal Ball is an MSNBC contributor and Democratic strategist. Richard, let me begin with a fellow Pennsylvanian. When I go to vote, sir, in Montgomery County, I sign my name. Is that enough of a precaution? Is that enough of a legitimacy check in our state?
Absolutely, Michael, and thank you for having me on the show. You know, for years, it's been plenty. Our judges of elections know us and recognize us, and it's all about local involvement. And we're trying to get to this big brother attitude of let's try to make everybody papers please when they walk into their polling place. When I've voted in the same place for 17 years and before that 20 years, my judge of elections knows me. His signature is fine. There is no voter fraud, as Reverend Al Sharpton mentioned. This is about failed ideas.
Well,
this is about the right wing.
That's the way it is at my polling place as well. They know me because I'm a blowhard, but they also know me because I've lived in the neighborhood for a long, long time.
Right.
In a neighborhood that has much more transition,
right.
I'm sure they don't get to know folks, and I wonder whether ballot security measures are sufficient at present. Somewhere in there's the proper balance.
Well, you know what? The thing is, the reason that I'm cynical about these attempts to sort of stop so-called voter fraud, I lived in Florida for 14 years. There's no place more transitional than that. People come and go. But when the Republicans in Florida decided to pass voter ID laws, they didn't get at the one place that there ever has been fraud, which is absentee balloting. But absentee balloting happens to be where Republicans are strongest, so they completely ignored the potential for absentee ballot voter fraud. And they went at the things that Democrats tend to do. Early voting, we'll just cut that down. Or, requiring an ID, things that tend to hit voters that don't vote for them.
Crystal, I think that there are isolated incidents of voter fraud that get blown out of proportion. One of them happened in my hometown in the 2008 cycle on Election Day, involving the so-called New Black Panthers, truly two knuckleheads, in my view, looking to get on TV and not to intimidate anybody. But Matt Drudge blew it way out of proportion. Rush Limbaugh then touted it, and all of a sudden, in the heartland, there was this concern that the election was being stolen. I guess my point is that it seems like there's a lack of data to prove that there's a problem that warrants such widespread change.
Yeah, as you're pointing out, it's been absolute, utter political propaganda. And there's another reason to be cynical other than the reasons that Joy-Ann was pointing out. If you look at which states have really pushed these efforts, and it goes way beyond just a government ID, they're attacking this process at every stage, from voter registration to when you can vote, as you said, the early voting, to then actually being able to vote on Election Day. But if you look at the states that have really pushed these efforts, they are states that have had large growths in minority populations. Places like Florida and Georgia and Texas have been on the front lines. And when you look at the fact that 25% of voting age African-American voters do not have the government ID that they are requiring, it becomes quite clear that this is an effort at voter suppression and a cynical, Machiavellian political tactic.
Richard, I want legitimate voters out there and voting. One of the things I'm most proud of is I've never missed an election in my life. We need more people voting, so long as they're legitimate. And I liked hearing Reverend Al say that to show an ID is not objectionable, so long as we're tapering what form of ID it might be to the community that we're trying to serve.
Well, and going back to what Crystal was saying, this is about fear. It's about the changing status quo. The folks that have been in charge are losing power, and they want to make sure that people don't vote. Anytime, if you erect a fence, if it's a foot, it's still a fence. If it's 10 feet, it's harder to get over, but if it's a foot high, it's still a fence. Any kind of attempt to keep people voting is wrong. You're absolutely right, Michael. America's about inclusion, not exclusion. And we got to make sure that more people vote and have the opportunity to vote. We don't need to be erecting barriers to our seniors. And in Pennsylvania, it would disenfranchise a disproportionate number of seniors.
Crystal,
but we saw, Wall Street and Santorum fail, and
thank you. Let me just ask Crystal Ball a quick question. How is this playing with eyes? How is this playing with independence? Because I know that folks who are partisan Ds are saying this is voter suppression. And the hardcore GOP base says, oh, no, it's just ballot integrity. And as I always like to underscore, the power really rests in the hands of independents, in my view, come November. What are they thinking as they watch this?
Well, this is my own personal opinion, not based on polling. But my sense is that thus far, Republicans have done a much better job of messaging on this issue, which is why I'm so grateful to people like Reverend Sharpton who are bringing this to the forefront, because I think this is the single most important issue facing the country. And it's not just in these voter suppression, voter ID laws. We also see in the pushback against illegal immigration. Ann Coulter said in her CPAC speech that if we allow illegal immigrants to become citizens, the whole country will go the way of California, and no Republican will be able to get elected again. This is about a broad range of efforts to keep their people at the polls and more Democratic-leaning voters out.
Joyanne, do you concede that thus far on this issue, the GOP has done a better imaging job?
Well, I think that people think it's logical that you should show an ID.
Right.
I think it's very hard to argue with the logic of that when you have to show an ID for so many other aspects of ordinary life. But I think that what Crystal said is where it gets to. Look, if you're the Republican Party right now, let's just keep it real, okay? Your base is getting down to primarily white men. You have lost Hispanics because of the messaging on immigration. You have lost African Americans decades ago for any number of reasons. You are now largely a southern Western party. You're landlocked to certain parts of the United States. So you can you can make yourself a national party two ways. You can either get more people to vote Republican and bring more people in, or you can get more of the other team away from the polls and keep them from voting. And right now, I think Republicans are playing a very cynical game. They're saying, listen, we can't grow our base, so we're going to try to suppress the other team.
Well, I think Reverend Sharpton had the right message for D's and for I's, people who are able to be persuaded on this issue, which is to say, to ask for identification is not offensive, not problematic, but let's be reasonable as to what form of identification it might be.
If you look in Texas, they're saying student ID is.
I know, but a gun license works. Yeah. End of argument. Richard Bloomingdale, thank you, sir, very much. Joyanne and Crystal, stick around.
Thank you.